Hi, everybody. Clarence Goodman here, and welcome to Women for All Seasons. The stories of six extraordinary women who, at one time or another, called Chicago their hometown. And they include Kate Warne, Ida B. Wells, Frances Glessner Lee, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Mother Dolores Hart, and Dr. Amy Lemon. Now, gang, I hope that these stories inspire you and uplift you and just give you some positive vibrations and so forth, because we can always use things like this at all times, and especially now. All of these images are used within the fair use guidelines and parameters of the American copyright law. Straight up, here we go. The first one up today is Kate Warne. She never slept. Now, Kate Warne was born in Arran, New York, the panhandle part of New York State. And not a whole lot is known about young Kate with regard to her early life, except for this. She got married young, and she got widowed young. She was a widow at 23 years old, so like all young widows, she did what they all do. She headed west to Chicago, probably trying to get a leg up on tickets for Wicked, nearly a century and a quarter in advance. I hope she got good seats. So she arrives in Chicago and she's looking for a job, and she sees that there is an advertisement for detectives as placed by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, headquartered in Chicago. And so she says, why not me? Though there were no female detectives in all of the world at this point. This is in the latter part of the 1850s. She arrives at the old Pinkerton headquarters. There it is, there at the corner of Lake Street and Dearborn. So next time you're in the Loop, gang, and you're at the Goodman Theater, the theater owned by my family, take a walk north for about a block and look to your left. You're going to be looking at a 7-Eleven. Before you go in for a Slurpee, just remember this. You were standing at the original site of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. She goes in for this job, and she meets none other than the great man himself, Alan Pinkerton, who sees her, sizes her up, and figures she is like many, many women who have been arriving in the city here of late during the Industrial Revolution, looking for gainful employment and a gig. The unprecedented migration, if you will, of women from small towns to big cities in the American experience. He is shocked to find that Kate Warne has no interest in being a secretary or stenographer. She indeed wants to be a detective. Well, upon informing her that there are no female detectives in the world, she says, why not me? And so Mr. Pinkerton, to his credit, said, yeah, why not you? And they sat down for an interview. And if you read Mr. Pinkerton's memoirs, it's wonderful the way he described her in retrospect and so forth. And I wonder if he made the observations, the very positive observations about her in real time. Nevertheless, he was quite taken with her from a professional perspective. And so he asked her, what could she do that would qualify her to be a detective? And she said, well, Mr. Pinkerton, men tend to brag, and men especially tend to brag if there is a woman nearby, in the hopes of getting this woman's telephone number or email address, even though the telephone and the internet were a ways away. Women could get men to talk. And then particularly a young woman, if a guy thinks that he had an opportunity with her, a chance, if he had any kind of game going on, she could really get his lips to start flapping. Moreover, she told Mr. Pinkerton, the average woman has a greater eye for detail than the average man. And these are imperative when it comes to being some sort of a detective, sleuthing out some sort of crime. And one last thing, a woman would be better at disguises than the average man. And so Mr. Pinkerton, rather than handing her a stenographer's pad, says, you are hired. You are the first woman detective. And he put her to work straight away. A case that the Pinkertons were working on was the Adams Express Company caper. Ooh, melodrama here. Look for a woman tied up on the railroad track in this image, gang. Actually, the Adams Express Company had to do with embezzlement, as most big cases of any sort did, murder or money. $50,000 had gone missing within the ranks of the Adams Express Company. The Adams Express Company specialized in the transfer of payrolls and bank payrolls and so forth, and payloads from place to place to place. Obviously, there was no ability to do things like this via telegraph back in the 1850s, and certainly you couldn't get a carrier pigeon to do it. Well, imagine that would really be difficult. So $50,000 turns up missing, and of course they had a suspect, a fellow by the name of one Nathan Maroney. The case of Nathan Maroney and the Adams Express Company. Sounds like something on Perry Mason, doesn't it? Well, what they needed was someone to get close to this man and get some information. And so, Agent Warne donned herself in the attire and the accoutrement that was similar to what Mrs. Maroney tended to wear, and befriended this woman. Got to talking, got to gabbing, got to hanging out like girlfriends, and before you know it, Mrs. Maroney started to talk about how her husband was doing such a great job, and that he had suddenly come into 50 large on the down low. Well, certainty becomes knowledge of fact. An arrest is made, and they were able to recover 39 of the $50,000. Now, how a person is able to spend $11,000 in the latter part of the 1850s is beyond me. There must have been a guitar store nearby. Wish I'd been there. So, one case down, way more to go. And so as we get closer to 1860, we have another problem afoot, and that is the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, the Knights of the Golden Circle was an organization, a national organization that dated back to the early part of the 19th century. And they were predicated upon the proposition that Southern states had the right to own slaves. And if that right were going to be taken away from them, they had the right to secede from the Union. Well, funny how things play out. The general election of November of 1860 made their greatest dreams or greatest fears materialize. And of course, that was the election of the 16th President of the United States, a tall drink of water by the name of one Abraham Lincoln. And so, many people had been trying to infiltrate the ranks of the Knights of the Golden Circle for some time, and indeed they had been successful, and they had learned that the plan to encourage southern states to secede from the Union had evolved into a plot to kidnap and assassinate the president-elect on his way to being inaugurated. And obviously, this is a big, big deal. And when the gentlemen such as Allan Pinkerton and so forth had approached the president-elect about trimming his public schedule and not making so many appearances, he said, no, I'm taking this train all the way from Springfield. I'm going to wind and wind and wind through this city, through this country, making as many stops as possible before I land up in Washington. Eerily foreshadowing the last train ride that this man would take. And so, with this in mind, the Pinkerton Detective Service and a number of local law enforcement officers around the country went into action. Now, let the record show there was no Secret Service at this point. The 16th president, indeed himself, was instrumental in the development of the Secret Service once he became president, but this was primarily to deal with counterfeiters, which was a big, big problem during the Civil War and after. And this lack of attention to protection of the president would really manifest itself on a bad night at the theater, April 14th, 1865. So, back in these days, the president was elected in November, as he or she is today, But the inauguration day was March 4th, Chicago's birthday, every year. So they had a few months to deal with and a big window that they had to protect President-elect Lincoln during. The secret down low signal of all of these Knights of the Golden Circle was wearing a rosette on their lapel, as you can see this gentleman here wearing. Men as well as ladies were so adorned, and this was their down low signal that, hey, you are a friend. Hey, I am a friend of the right to enslave people. And so the Pinkerton Detective Service, along with Agent Warne, went into action. And let me tell you something. Agent Warne zigged and zagged left to right. Oh, and by the way, Ellen Pinkerton almost immediately promoted her to oversee the D.C. field office of the Pinkertons. That's how well she was thought of at this point. She had hardly been there, and she's still a woman in her 20s at this point. She is going left and right, and it is determined that President Lincoln will be abducted in Baltimore and murdered. And so the Pinkerton Detective Service decided they were going to come up with some shenanigans to see the president safely to Washington. They talked the president-elect into, at a particular point, as they got closer to Washington. I believe it was in New York City. They met his train in New York City, and they got him to don a disguise. So they got him to take off his iconic stovepipe hat and throw a shawl over his shoulders, and then he was expected to blend into the crowd. Well, this is like asking a person 6'10" today to blend into the crowd. Imagine standing in line at the post office, and there's a 6'10" power forward looming over you, being posted up in the post office, if you will. But nevertheless, the president-elect cooperated with this, and Agent Warne and the other agents went into work. Now, Agent Warne stayed up all night procuring the services of an entire sleeping car that she was able to keep empty in anticipation of the president-elect's arrival in Philadelphia, where they were going to pick him up and then continue to zig and zag. Actually, that was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So Agent Warne stays up. She gets this railroad car for the president-elect of the United States, and he has a secure place with which to sleep and stay on his way into the city. Agent Warne, after this successful excursion, and that is the president-elect indeed was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, she moves on, and sadly, the inauguration of the 16th President of the United States led to the next crisis when it came to this country. That is, the secession of the southern states and ultimately the Civil War. And so Agent Warne and a handful of other Pinkerton detective agents got the plum opportunity and task of dressing up as Confederate officers and Confederate soldiers and going behind enemy lines in order to pick up scuttlebutt, in order to pick up the tactics of troop movement, maybe even some long-term strategy and things of this nature. Obviously, Agent Warne was the only one who had to do this dressed up in drag, inspiring an episode down the line, about 100 years later, actually, of the Three Stooges. Now, Agent Warne continued her work diligently and left us a few years after the Civil War at the ripe old age of 34 years old. However, before she left this planet, not only was Agent Kate Warne the first woman detective, she also opened the door for other women. She was made head of the Pinkerton Detectives DC field office, and she inspired the company's slogan, Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, we never sleep. Oh yeah, and by the way, she helped to save the life of President-elect Abraham Lincoln. Let the record show that there are more children's books written about Agent Warne than there are adult books. So hopefully the silver lining we can hope for in this situation is that some young person will be inspired, grow up to be an investigative journalist, and write the definitive biography of Agent Warne when she or he is an adult. And I hope I'm around to read it. because there ain't one right now. Hope to see you again real soon, gang, with part 2 of this series. That is Ida B. Wells' Force of Nature. Until that time, do take care of yourselves out there. May God bless you. May your God go with you. And so long, everybody.